Hello, my name is Keith Detwieler, and I am a speaker and producer with Little Light Ministries. And I've been doing that for a number of years, and we'll start to get into how it is that God led me to that position. But before we get there, we have to back up a little bit. I was born pretty much into an Adventist family. That's a Protestant denomination if you're not familiar with Adventists. And my parents didn't take me to church until I was about, maybe 4 years old. They said I was too much of a handful, so I got left with a babysitter before then. And we were pretty regular church attendees from as far back as I can remember until about 14 years old. And at 14, my father had an argument with the pastor. And it was over something very silly. It was who was going to have the special music at some near date in the future. And it was from that my family actually left the church. We didn't go to any church anywhere for a number of years, about 7 years actually. And so most of my teenage years, I just spent out of the church doing whatever on any day. I mean, I grew up observing the Sabbath, but I remember in my teenage years, because we were away from church, that the lawn needed to be mowed, it got mowed on Sabbath. So there are a number of things that started to become different in my life. I remember that I started taking in a lot of media during that time. So movies, TV shows, things like that, spending a lot of time on the internet, pretty techie. So I remember my grandpa started sending me computers about that time, and I would take them apart, put them together, and try to program them and get online and whatever I could get on, AOL, Instant Messenger, ICQ, all these things, and go into chat rooms and meet people from all over the world. And it was during that time that all these influences were coming in, and they weren't leading me on a path that I had been grown up with in Christianity. So I tell people something that I say I'm not always very proud of, but it got to the point where I didn't hesitate to put anything before my eyes. And I don't elaborate too much on that. I let people's imagination run whichever direction it wants to. But I looked at all manner of things, and I knew that I shouldn't, but I didn't feel like I had a good reason not to. So fast forward, I'm about 21 years old, and I'm in school. I started school a little late. I started at 19. I took a year off between high school and university. And during that time, lots of media. My parents were on the road. I was kind of studying. I didn't know that I was going to college, but my parents told me I had to. I thought I was just going to get a job. And so I spent that time just kind of getting ready for school. Well, I got to school and started meeting all these, people. I wasn't used to being around a lot of people. The town I went to high school in was very small. It's about 1,000 people in the whole town. My high school class had maybe 30 people in it. And so it was kind of isolated. When I got to school, I met all of these people, and I noticed that a lot of the girls, smoked, drank, partied, all those kind of things, that even though my family had walked away from Christianity, the church, really, I mean, we didn't really walk away from Christianity. We would pray before our meals and things like that, but walked away from the church. And I seen these girls behaving that way, and I thought, this is really not for me. I thought that I held myself to a higher standard than that. And I just kind of, already by that age, kind of given up on relationships, thought, I'd never meet anybody anyway, and had a very pessimistic view on life. But as it turns out, I did meet a young lady. It was very different from all the rest. And when I met her, she was reading her Bible. And I thought, well, that's a really strange thing at a public university. You don't see that really happening. And so we started to get to know each other. It was about this same time that my family started going back to church. The pastor of the local congregation had moved on to another church, and so there was a new pastor. He had visited us at our home. My parents weren't home. I was the only one there. I was really intrigued by him because he had a South African accent. And he came with one of the local church elders. And I didn't let him in, it was kind of real standoffish. But I told my parents, and, within the next couple of years, we started going back to church. And it was also at that same time that I didn't know it at the time, but um, there were people that were attending that local Adventist church that were about my age, and they had been attending the same university. One of them I was sitting next to in one of my classes. Didn't really know that much about her, but I knew she was a nice person. Met her brother. He was in one of my math classes, and I listened to him talk to somebody about some serious things. And there's just a few words that kind of triggered in my mind, and I thought, you know what? That guy's a Seventh-day Adventist. I knew that he was. And so I approached him after class in the science and math building, and I asked him that question flat out. He's like, "You're a Seventh-day Adventist, aren't you?" And he's, big smile. He said, "Yes. How did you know?" And I said, "Well, I just know. I can tell by the way you talk," which is pretty powerful, to think that the way that you talk, the way that you behave, people can identify a group that you're with, or identify things about you just by that. But it was very strong in his life. So we got to know each other a little bit better. And as I was getting to know this other young lady, we would have these discussions about the Bible. And of course, I didn't know very much. I'd been out of church for 7 years. I didn't remember anything during that time. I never studied my Bible. I maybe opened a Bible once or twice, tried to read it and put it back down because I thought it was too hard. And, as I was talking with her, she asked me a couple of questions that really challenged me. And she had 5 things. I only remember 2 of them. But she says, most people don't know what they believe or why they believe it. And I started to think about that. I thought, do I know what I believe? And do I know why I believe it? I would say, if somebody asked me, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, but what is that? What do they believe? And so I started to study for myself, despite whatever my family was going to do. I had fond memories of the church, fond memories growing up. I never wanted to leave. I missed going to Sabbath school and things like that. And so I started studying on my own, and I found Amazing Facts Bible study guides. I started studying them, and I would talk to this girl every night eventually, and we would talk about these things on the phone, and I would have my little Amazing Facts study guide and try to ask her questions or give her answers based on what I had there. And through that process, we got to know each other pretty well. And eventually, we got engaged, and she's the lady that I'm married to today. Her name is Rachel. And we have 4 children together, and we've been married for 15 years now. So God used her to really work in my life and wake me up and start to get me to answer some hard questions, if you will, and study for myself. And I was determined that this is what I was going to do, and didn't matter what my family did or not. But eventually my family, also started going back to church. And so that was helpful. We started to integrate ourselves back. But there was this part of my life still, this media, heavy consumption of media. In school, I even took a class that was called Finding the Science in Science Fiction. And I had 2 of my chemistry professors. They started this class, and we called it the movie class because we got to watch clips of movies and then kind of analyze the science behind it, whether it was, really on track or not. It was an easy class. You took it at night and no big deal. But that class really appealed to me because of the things that I was taking in at that time. And So here I was married to Rachel, and it was kind of a rough go for our engagement time. When my dad came back to the church, he came back very strong, and he did not like the fact that she was not an Adventist. And he really kind of encouraged and pushed me to find somebody who was. Well, the local congregation that I went to, you could say that it was a small pond, and there weren't very many fish in that pond. Not too many girls to really associate with, even. But I kept pursuing a relationship with Rachel despite all of this, and I remember kind of early on in that experience that I thought, here I am, I'm responding to the things that I'm reading in the Bible, I'm responding to the roots of what I grew up with in my faith. And I thought, now is a really perfect opportunity for a distraction. And so if the devil wanted to get me off track, a girl is really a perfect way to do it. And so I gave God permission at that time. I said, if this is not of you, if it's a distraction, I don't want it in my life. And I'm giving you permission to end the relationship, which was a hard thing to do because I really liked her. But as I laid that on the altar, God spoke to me very clearly. And he said words that I'm pretty sure I'll never forget. He said, she will become a Seventh-day Adventist. And I really struggled with that because I thought, well, am I hearing things? Is it just me? Is that what I want? And I really analyzed it for a while. And so as I sat and thought about it, I said, well, if it was me, that's kind of dangerous. But if it's God, it'll come to pass. So I kept pursuing the relationship for a little bit longer. And I thought, I'm not going to tell anybody. Because if it's God, God can work it out. And I don't need to discuss this with anybody. Because I don't want any interference in God's plans or any other people's thoughts. So we had a dating relationship for about 3.5 years, which was pretty long compared to most people that we know. But I remember during that time, especially towards the last year, my dad started putting what I felt was like a lot of pressure. And I remember one day, Rachel, she had drove me home, and we were sitting in the driveway at my parents' place. So I got to live at home the whole time I was in college. It saved me a lot of money. And I just broke it off. I couldn't take the family pressure anymore. And I left and just, went inside and went to my room, and, that was the end of that. At least I thought. She wouldn't leave. And I didn't know this, but she wouldn't leave. She got out of the car, she went to the front steps, and she sat there, and she was crying. And my parents heard her crying outside because they had a bedroom in the basement, and it was a split-level house. So they came out, and they brought her in. They asked her what happened, and she told them. And then they proceeded to tell her, that not to worry about it. My dad specifically told her, it was his fault. He realized, he was putting a lot of pressure on the situation. But he also said, that he would be hypocritical if he interfered, because my mom was a Baptist when they got married. So he felt like he didn't have any room to say anything in that matter, I guess. So after that, we got engaged, and things actually became much easier. But going back to this point of Was this really God or not? Prior to me trying to break up with her, there was another incident where we had a fight on some religious topic. I think it was the mark of the beast or something. And since we were in the habit of calling each other every night and we'd had this argument, I decided, well, I'm not going to call her. And I didn't think she would call me. And I thought, well, that's the end of the relationship right there. And it was somewhere around 11 o'clock at night. And I started reflecting back. I thought, I thought God had spoke to me and told me that, she will become a Seventh-day Adventist. It's like, that's, obviously not true now. I know that because this relationship is pretty much over. I'm not going to call her. That's the end of things. And I was just being stubborn. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to pray one more time about this because it's really unlikely what I'm about to pray. So I said, okay, Lord, if that was really you, have her call in the next 5 minutes. She had no reason to call. We were mad at each other. And, it was 11 o'clock at night. And about 4 minutes go by, nothing. And then the phone rings, and it was her. And I don't even remember the conversation, but I remember after that point, I said, okay, Lord, I'm not doubting you on this point again. I'm just going to keep it in my heart, and we'll just leave it there. So I pursued the relationship knowing that we were coming from different denominational backgrounds. She was more of a non-denominational person. She went to a big church, like 2,000 to 4,000 members, something like that. The church that I was going to was like, maybe 150 members. And, the whole time we were dating, we kind of had this bargain. I would go to her church one week, she would go to my church the other week. We kind of traded off back and forth. And, it worked out. We got married outside instead of getting married in a church because it complicates things with family and you don't know exactly what to do. And so we got married by a relative of mine who was a non-denominational minister, and we got married. And we got along pretty well, and we liked each other, and there was, we kept going to each other's church, except it was every week now. But God was really working on her heart in ways that I didn't know. And I didn't know that until much later. And so I remember about 4 months into our marriage, we went to the pastor's house. He was having a social. It's a new pastor than even the one that, was this South African. And we went over there, and there was a gentleman there, and he was giving his testimony. He was a former Catholic, and he was telling about how he was converted and the things in the Bible that, he now knew were true. And, I guess he was watching watching a satellite dish, and there was a program on it. And after the program was on the Mark of the Beast, and he switched the channel because he thought that was crazy. And then his curiosity got the best of him. And so he came back to the channel, watched the rest of the program, ordered the series, watched it, then watched it with his wife. And he was basically converted before he ever set forth his foot in a church. And he was telling him all of this and what happens when you die and all these things from the Bible and giving the scriptural evidence. And I'm thinking, my wife's probably feeling very uncomfortable right now because here's a group of Adventists and they're talking about all these unique, doctrines and points on their faith. And so I made an excuse to leave. And I didn't know it at the time, but she was actually very interested in what he was saying because he had no bias towards her. And so she thought, he doesn't know who I am. He's not trying to convert me. He's just giving this information. So we drive home, We lived in an apartment at the time, drove into the carport, and she said something that really surprised me. She said, "I want to study Daniel and Revelation with you." It's only 4 months into our marriage, and I was super excited because here was the answer, or at least the beginning of the answer, to a prayer, that I had given God permission several years ago. So we started listening to some audio at night of a sermon series by David Asherick on Daniel and Revelation. So we would put together a puzzle and listen, and he went through the whole message, and just kind of left it at that. And after we were done, we just kept doing what we were doing. But the gentleman who had given his testimony, him and his wife had started attending the local church, and we were becoming friends with them. And it wasn't too long after that we found out that both of us were pregnant at the same time. So we started spending a lot of time with them. I had already scheduled some trip, I think before we got married, to India to go and do an evangelistic series there. So about the time my son was born, my oldest son, he was 3 weeks old, and I left for India. And when I got back, 3 weeks later, my wife had listened to the same sermon series that this gentleman had listened to. It was like 36 messages. And his wife really started encouraging my wife to join the church. And so she joined by profession of faith at the same time that our son, was dedicated. And I remember after that experience, it's like, here she is, she joined the church, and I asked God, I said, I thought she was going to be baptized. And it was again that God again spoke very clearly to me. And he said, I never said she was going to be baptized. I just said she would join the church, or she would become a Seventh-day Adventist. And so I thought about that, and I was like, well, okay, yeah, that makes sense. She's already been baptized. Joining by profession of faith is a perfectly valid way to become a Seventh-day Adventist. And so I think it was that night that I told her, my part of the story, where I had, relinquished the relationship several years ago, gave God permission to remove it, and the words that he spoke to me. And so, that was a surprising story to her. And, it's been very clear in our relationship that we were supposed to be together, and that God had a plan for both of us in that. Another thing that happened early on in our marriage is I remember sitting down with Rachel and telling her, I feel like I'm supposed to be working in ministry. And I said, but before that happens, I know that there's 3 things in my life that have to change. 1, I have to change what I'm eating. 2, I have to change what I'm watching. And 3, I need to be willing to move anywhere. And so God actually worked in that order. I'd become a vegetarian just after we got engaged, because I thought, you know what, I really know better. I really know I shouldn't be eating all these different meats and stuff. So I became a vegetarian. And God had actually put a strong desire in Rachel's heart to be a very healthful person. And so we had watched some presentations, and she was the one that actually said, why don't we eat a plant-based diet? And my initial response was, what? No cheese? But you know what? We thought, the information that we've seen says this is the healthiest way to live. And so we made a decision and a commitment just after we were we had found out we were pregnant with our first child, that we were going to eat a plant-based diet. And we ordered a cookbook on Amazon, and we've never looked back. I mean, it was hard. You're talking, this is 15 years ago. There weren't the same availability of options and ingredients and, places to go out to eat and things like that. But we stuck with it. And we had determined that this is what we were going to do for ourselves, despite what everybody else did around us. And that wasn't coming from a standpoint of judgment. We just wanted to have healthy bodies and healthy minds to serve God. And that's really what it's all about. Because it's not in my eating that I earn my salvation. It's not in my exercise that I earn my salvation. That can only come by the grace of Christ. But we just wanted to be happy and healthy doing it. And so we've been doing that for the last 15 years. So that was the first change that came our way. The next change was what I was watching. I remember I was working in a laboratory, second shift. I would come home, it's late at night, probably 10, 11 o'clock by the time I got home. And I was on this kick of watching this TV show that I'd never seen before. And it was older, and so now I could just kind of binge watch multiple episodes, whole seasons, and we could just get through them really fast. And it really wasn't something that's healthy for your mind. It was really just, it was action, it was suspense, but there's a lot of people being killed. And, it just isn't, we're not designed to see things die, really. And so I remember after we moved from the apartment, we had 2 children by that time, and we moved out into a home in the country that God had really worked through that situation pretty amazingly. We had looked at so many places and couldn't find what we wanted. And the one place that we wound up getting was the one place that when I walked into it said, we can't afford this. There's no way. But God worked it out. He had a place for us. And so we moved into a rural area. We lived on a gravel road. We were out in the country, started a garden, all these nice things that's good for your family. And when we were there, we had internet. It was pretty poor, really bad internet, actually. But I was able to see some videos on Facebook. This same friend that had given his testimony that inspired my wife, he had a nephew, and his nephew had started coming around to the Advent message. And he posted these videos called Battlefield Hollywood. And it was of Scott Meyer. He was speaking at Weimar, I think are the ones that I watched. And here it was that I finally found a reason for why I wouldn't just continue to watch anything and everything. And so I always tell people, for me, this was the 3 angels message of Revelation 14. It was God saying, this is why you need a healthy mind, not just a healthy body, but a healthy mind, because it's the mind that God communicates with. Now, of course, he was willing to reach me where I was at several years ago, but to continue to work with me moving forward, he had to take me to the next step. And I think God's that way with so many people. He works with you where you're at, and he gently leads you along until you're ready for that next step. And so God knew I was ready for that next step, and that the things that I was putting in my mind, even though I knew I shouldn't watch them, I didn't feel like I had a reason. And here was the reason, because the mind needed to be ready. It needed to be cleansed, if you will, just like the Bible teaches about this message called the sanctuary message. And it talks about the Day of Atonement. And in that Day of Atonement, there's a cleansing that happens. And so these are the things that was being connected in my mind. And so we said, okay, we're going to put these things away from us. We're not going to be filling our minds with all this Hollywood stuff anymore. So I got a bunch of videos from them, and I watched them, and I learned a lot. And you know, here I had this strong desire to still work in ministry, and I thought, this is really interesting, because I've watched a lot of the things that they talk about. I mean, I've consumed so much media by this point. It was like my national pastime. This is just what I did with my free time, my spare time. I just consumed anything and everything. And I thought, here's an interesting ministry that it seems like it would be easier for me to be a part of. And so God was working on me. He just needed to, take one more step. So I wrote them. I tried to send emails and offer to help and things like that, but it didn't really go anywhere. And about 9 months after that, one of the speakers for Little Light came to my church, and it was Brandon Mascarenas. And Brandon spoke over a weekend, and it was a lot of the same things that I'd learned through the videos, and I thought, this is great. And I tried to offer any help that I could give to Brandon. Of course, being on the other side of that now, you hear that a lot. There's people that want to help, but sometimes it doesn't always work out circumstantially. And so I don't know what Brandon was thinking, or if it was hard to get the logistics to work out, but it never really went anywhere. But I couldn't get it out of my mind. And so about 9 months after that, I was transitioning in my company. I went out of the laboratory into a desk job. And I thought, you know what? I'm starting a new job. I'm just going to make a phone call. So I called Little Light, not knowing who I would get or what would happen. And I think I got Chris. He doesn't work for Little Light, hasn't for a number of years. And he gave me Scott's cell phone number. So I called Scotty. Scotty was at home. And I just poured my heart out to him for about an hour. And at the end, I said, "Does that sound crazy?" And he said, "No, it doesn't sound crazy." And I was basically saying, I feel like I need to help you guys. I feel like I should be working with you guys. And he had some questions for me. He said, "Can you edit video?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you do graphic design or anything like that?" And I was like, "Nope." He's like, "Well, what do you do?" It's like, "I work in chemistry." And there was this kind of, awkward silence, because what do you do with that? How does that help? But I told him, the one thing I had experience doing was speaking. By this time at church, God had continued to lead in my life. I was the head elder of the church, and I had spent, multiple Sabbaths speaking, and it was a skill that God was honing in my life. So he sent me some presentations, and he said, "Why don't you try this? Just see what you can do in your local area. And we'll send you some videos, and maybe you can drum up some sales and things like that. We've talked about having a distributor." So I said, "Okay." And I did a couple of small things in my area, and I started over time helping them with their website. That was an area that they were paying for some contract group. So I thought, "Hey, I got a job. I got the talent. I'll just put my own money into that and help these guys out." And it wasn't long after that there was a speaking request that came in for Chicago. And they actually tossed it my direction. They said, "Why don't you do that one?" And I said, "Okay." That was kind of scary. And I think maybe there was one before that in Denver. So I did that one. And then that one in Chicago, and there's like 300 people there. I was nervous, but God led, and God used me to develop relationships in that area. I've been back to that same part of the country 4 times now. Um, and it's been a real blessing. And, as we continued to work together at a distance, I kind of started handling a lot of the incoming emails. And my whole burden for them was like, I don't know how to do the same things that you guys do. I don't know how to edit video. I don't know how to do the graphic design. I don't know how to do those things. But I know how to build websites, and I can centralize your communication. And I thought, if nothing else, maybe I can ease some of their burdens to give them more time to work. So that's what I started doing. And in 2013, they invited me out for a camping trip. And so I went out, first time I'd ever really been camping. It wasn't really camping, it was really backpacking. And it was in Tahoe, and it was quite an ordeal. But we went through that experience, and at the end, we started really talking about what it would look like for me to join the ministry. And Scotty had just laid it on the altar with God. If that was to happen, they needed the money. I mean, obviously, we're taking on another person. And so God answered that part of the question for them. They actually were sent the amount of money that they needed, or pretty close to it. And then I had an issue. I had to sell my house. And here I am by this point. I'm super busy. I have a full-time job, head elder. I have a family. By this time, we have 3 children. And I told God, I said, God, I can't, I don't even have time to talk to a realtor. I am so busy. I said, God, if you want me to join that ministry and you want to make this happen, you need to sell my house. So he did. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call, and there was a lady on the other line that said, I hear that you want to sell your house. She was the daughter of a church member. And this church member, I remember 6 months ago, I had said something to her I would never talk to her about. I told her, I think God's laying on my heart that I should be ready to sell my house. I almost never talked to this lady. And for some reason, those words came out of my mouth. And 6 months later, her daughter calls me after a prayer. And so she got some details about the house from me, and then she wanted to drive by, and the next thing she wanted to look inside, and then I had an offer. And I thought, wow, it really kind of sent chills up and down my spine. So everything was done in like 2 or 3 months. And it was a bad time to sell a home. It was 2012, and in America, our economy was still really trying to recover from 2011. So we moved out, and we moved in with my mother-in-law, which I thought was going to be for a couple of weeks. And it turned up being 14 months because I couldn't find a place to live in California. The prices were super high. I didn't want to buy a house right away. I didn't know what our financial situation was going to be. And we had an extra complication. Right after we agreed to sell the house, my wife came to me and she said, we're pregnant. And so I thought, well, because I don't know exactly what's going to happen in California, I don't even know if these guys have insurance or what. Let's just wait and have the baby, and then we'll go after that. So we did that. And then, a year goes by. I'm still having a hard time, but it was all in God's timing. We did find a place, and we moved out to California. And I don't know, it was, I remember it was like October 31 is when we landed or something in 2013. I said I went out for a camping trip in 2013, but it was actually 2012. So we landed in 2013, and I've been working with Little Light ever since. And, I've been able to go all around the country, all around the world, actually, sharing the speaking load with Scott and ministering to people and helping them understand that the reason that we need to have a clean mind is because Jesus is coming soon. He wants to communicate with you. He wants you to be in a position where you are discerning of the truth. And so you don't want to be filling your mind with just anything and everything. And, we've been able to minister to lots of people and help a lot of people. and develop relationships with a lot of people, and get them to see that it's not just about necessarily what you're watching. It's about the fact that Jesus is coming again, and it's time to be ready. And part of being ready is having a clear mind. So um, that's really how God has been leading in my life and working. And it's been an adventure. It's been uncomfortable at times because you don't always know if there's a paycheck coming. Fortunately for all of us, the last several years, everything's been really stable. God has been really good to us. And I just have gotten to the point where I don't worry about it anymore. And whatever God wants us to have, He'll provide. And it's a really kind of exciting way to live sometimes. I really like to travel. I like to go and speak with people. That's probably the most exciting part of my job. Now I still help out with the website, and since then I've learned to edit. I've learned to do some graphic design. Help with the technology because I already had a kind of a bend toward that anyway. So that's what I'm doing, and it has been an amazing experience to see how God leads and how God answers prayer and how God knows the person for your life, how God knows where you need to be and when and why. And it's really helped build my faith in God. And I'm not saying that there's things today I don't struggle with. God is always, leading you to the next big obstacle where He can say, "Do you still trust me?" But you can keep looking back and realizing that God is trustworthy and God does take care of people, and He's not going to leave us or forsake us. And there's a verse in Hebrews, at least part of it, that I like to quote. It says, "He who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He's a rewarder of those who seek Him." And I've thought about that many times, like, believe that He is what? And I always tell people, fill in the blank. What is God? What is He to you? What does He need to be for you? And that's not making God into something of our own mind, but is He your creator? Is He your redeemer? Is He your savior? Is He your provider? All of those things, believe that He is, because that's what God is. He can fill in those blanks in your life and really lead you and place you wherever you need to be. And He can take care of all the hard details. I've been there, and God is faithful.